What if I told you that in December 1944, when over 250,000 German forces smashed through American lines in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Supreme Allied Commander looked his generals in the eye and said there would be only cheerful faces at this conference table? What if I told you that instead of panic or retreat, Dwight Eisenhower saw this moment not as disaster, but as opportunity? This wasn't just bravado or foolish optimism. This was strategic genius that would turn Hitler's last great gamble into his most crushing defeat. Picture this scene: snow-covered Belgium, December 1944. American soldiers, many of them teenagers who had never seen combat, suddenly found themselves facing the most desperate and vicious German assault since D-Day. Panzers emerged from the mist like steel phantoms, their guns blazing, their crews knowing this was Germany's final chance to change the war's outcome. Villages that had celebrated liberation just months before now echoed with the sound of artillery and the screams of wounded men. In command posts across the Ardennes, American officers stared at maps showing German spearheads driving deep into Allied territory. Radio chatter filled with desperate calls for reinforcements, reports of units being overrun, entire divisions cut off from supply lines. The very real possibility existed that Hitler might achieve what had seemed impossible just weeks before, splitting the Allied armies and perhaps forcing a negotiated peace. Yet in the eye of this storm stood one man whose response would defy every conventional military instinct. While others saw disaster unfolding, Eisenhower would see something entirely different. His reaction would be so unexpected, so contrary to traditional military wisdom, that it would leave even his closest allies questioning his judgment. But by the end of this story, you'll understand why this moment of apparent madness was actually pure genius. Today we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal moments of World War II, when everything hung in the balance and one man's unexpected reaction changed the course of history. This is the story of how Eisenhower's counterintuitive response to being surrounded transformed catastrophe into victory, and why his decision would echo through military strategy for generations to come. December 16th, 1944. General Dwight David Eisenhower, freshly promoted to the rarefied rank of General of the Army, one of only 5 men in American history to hold such distinction, was looking forward to a light day. The Supreme Allied Commander had every reason to be optimistic. 6 months and 10 days had passed since D-Day, and Allied forces had pushed German armies back from the beaches of Normandy all the way to Germany's doorstep. Victory in 1945 seemed not just possible, but probable. The morning had started routinely enough. Reports from across the Western Front showed the usual pattern of limited German resistance, successful Allied advances, and steady progress toward the Rhine River. Intelligence estimates suggested German forces were demoralized, undersupplied, and incapable of major offensive operations. The consensus among Allied commanders was that Germany was finished as an offensive threat. Now it was simply a matter of time before the final collapse. Eisenhower had spent the morning planning to attend his orderly Mickey McKeo's wedding at Versailles, a small moment of normalcy in the midst of commanding the largest military operation in human history. McKeo had served faithfully through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and now France. The wedding represented something precious in wartime: hope, continuity, the promise that life would go on after the killing stopped. But as he met with General Omar Bradley that afternoon to discuss troop replacements, news arrived that would test every leadership principle Eisenhower had ever learned. A strong German attack had begun in the Ardennes Forest. Initial reports were confused, contradictory. Some units reported being overrun, others claimed they were holding their positions. Communication lines were being cut faster than they could be repaired. While Bradley dismissed it as a localized counterattack, perhaps a spoiling attack to disrupt Allied offensive preparations, something in Eisenhower's gut told him this was different. He had learned to trust his instincts during 2 years of commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean. The scattered reports were beginning to form a pattern, and that pattern looked frighteningly familiar to anyone who remembered May 1940, when German panzers had burst through these same Ardennes forests to devastating effect. This wasn't just any moment. This was the moment that would define not just the war's outcome, but Eisenhower's legacy as a leader. Everything he had built since taking command of Allied forces, every relationship he had cultivated, every strategic decision he had made, would now be tested against Hitler's final gamble. What happened next would reveal the difference between a good general and a great one, between conventional wisdom and revolutionary thinking. To understand Eisenhower's shocking response to being surrounded, we need to understand the man himself. Born in Denison, Texas in 1890, Dwight Eisenhower came from humble beginnings in Abilene, Kansas. His path to supreme command wasn't through battlefield heroics or military brilliance in youth. It was through an almost supernatural ability to see the big picture while managing complex personalities and competing interests. The third of 7 sons in a deeply religious family, young Dwight learned early that success came not from being the loudest voice in the room, but from being the one who could bring others together toward a common purpose. His father, David, worked in a creamery and struggled to make ends meet. The family motto was simple: work hard, tell the truth, and take care of each other. These values would shape everything Eisenhower did as a commander. Unlike Patton, who craved combat, or Montgomery, who demanded recognition, Eisenhower had spent most of his early career as a staff officer. He never commanded troops in World War I. Instead, he trained tank crews at Camp Colt in Pennsylvania, while his contemporaries earned their spurs in the trenches of France. Many saw this as a limitation. History would prove it was preparation for something far greater. At Camp Colt, Eisenhower commanded 10,000 men and 600 officers in the largest tank training facility in the United States. Here, he learned to manage complex logistics, coordinate between competing military branches, and most importantly, to think systematically about warfare. While other officers focused on tactics, how to win individual engagements, Eisenhower was learning to think operationally, how to coordinate multiple units across vast distances towards strategic objectives. The young Eisenhower learned to think systematically about warfare, logistics, and most critically, coalition management. When he served under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines during the 1930s, he witnessed firsthand how ego and politics could undermine military effectiveness. MacArthur was undoubtedly brilliant, but his need to be the center of attention often created more problems than it solved. Eisenhower watched, learned, and internalized a different approach. During those years in Manila, Eisenhower also gained his first real understanding of Asian military philosophy. He studied how successful Asian commanders throughout history had often won not through direct confrontation, but by allowing enemies to overextend themselves, then striking when they were most vulnerable. This wasn't the Western way of war. It required patience, strategic thinking, and the confidence to let situations develop rather than trying to control every variable. These experiences taught him that in modern warfare, the general who could coordinate disparate forces and maintain unity of command would prove more valuable than the one who could win individual battles. Coalition warfare wasn't about being the strongest voice. It was about being the voice that all the other strong voices would listen to. This background shaped a fundamental contradiction in Eisenhower's character. He was a man who understood that sometimes the most aggressive action was patience, that sometimes the boldest move was restraint, and that sometimes victory required letting your enemy expose themselves rather than immediately striking back. These lessons would prove crucial when faced with the largest German offensive since 1940. The Battle of the Bulge represented a collision between two fundamentally different military philosophies. Hitler, desperate and increasingly detached from reality, conceived the operation entirely himself. His plan was classically Napoleonic: mass, overwhelming force at a single point, achieve breakthrough, divide and conquer. It was the same strategy that had worked brilliantly in 1940 when German panzers knifed through this very same Ardennes Forest. Hitler's thinking was rooted in the heroic tradition of warfare, the belief that superior will, properly applied at the decisive point, could overcome any material disadvantage. He named the operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, deliberately invoking Germanic mythology and the romantic notion of a last desperate stand against overwhelming odds. This wasn't just military strategy. It was psychological warfare aimed as much at bolstering German morale as defeating Allied forces. The Führer's plan was audacious in its scope. 3 armies would burst through Allied lines in the Ardennes, race to the port of Antwerp, split British and American forces, and potentially force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. It was the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that had characterized Hitler's rise to power, but by December 1944, Germany could no longer afford such gambles. But Eisenhower represented a new kind of military thinking. what military historians would later call operational art. This wasn't just about winning battles. It was about orchestrating campaigns across multiple theaters with multiple allies toward strategic objectives. Where Hitler saw warfare as a series of decisive battles, Eisenhower understood it as a complex system of interconnected operations. Eisenhower's approach was fundamentally systematic rather than heroic. He understood that modern warfare was won not by brilliant tactical strokes, but by superior logistics, coordination, and the ability to sustain operations across vast distances and timeframes. While Hitler was planning one dramatic blow that might change everything, Eisenhower was thinking about how to manage the inevitable German defeat in a way that maximized Allied advantages and minimized casualties. The genius of Eisenhower's approach lay in his understanding of what military theorists call the strategic paradox of defense. Conventional wisdom dictated that when attacked, you immediately counterattack or fall back to prepared positions. But Eisenhower grasped something deeper. Sometimes the enemy's offensive creates the very conditions for their destruction. By committing to a major offensive, the Germans were abandoning their strongest asset, their defensive positions, and exposing themselves to the Allies' greatest advantages: air power, logistics, and numerical superiority. This philosophical difference would manifest in the most crucial moment of the battle. While Hitler demanded his generals take more ground at any cost, Eisenhower would make a decision that seemed to contradict every military instinct. He would let the Germans come to him. It was a decision that would require nerves of steel and absolute confidence in his strategic vision, because in the short term, it would mean watching American soldiers pay the price for his patience. By December 19th, the situation looked dire. 3 German armies were carving through American lines like a hot knife through butter. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from the United States, with no combat experience, had been virtually destroyed. 2 entire regiments, over 7,000 men, had been captured in what would become the largest surrender of American forces in the European theater. The Germans had advanced over 30 miles in some sectors, creating a massive bulge in Allied lines that threatened to split American and British forces completely. Panic was beginning to spread through Allied command structures. Staff officers were burning classified documents at headquarters, preparing for possible evacuation. Rumors flew that German commandos in American uniforms were operating behind the lines, assassinating officers and redirecting traffic. Even George Patton, never one to show concern, described the situation as Krauts speaking perfect English, raising hell, cutting wires, turning road signs around, spooking whole divisions. The weather was equally terrifying. Dense fog and snow had grounded Allied air forces, eliminating the decisive advantage that had carried them from Normandy to the German border. Without air support, American ground forces were facing German armor with limited anti-tank capabilities. Radio communications were sporadic, supply lines were cut, and entire units were fighting desperately without knowing whether relief was coming. It was in this moment of apparent crisis that Eisenhower called his commanders to meet in a freezing cold army barracks in Verdun, France. The choice of location was deliberate. Verdun, site of the longest and bloodiest battle of World War I, where French forces had held against impossible odds. Present were Bradley, Patton, and other top Allied commanders. The room was tense, the news grim, casualties mounting by the hour. Everyone expected orders for immediate withdrawal or desperate defensive measures. Instead, Eisenhower stood up and delivered what would become one of the most famous statements in military history. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. The audacity of this statement cannot be overstated. 250,000 German soldiers were smashing through American lines, and the Supreme Allied Commander was calling it an opportunity. Some of his subordinates later admitted they thought their commander had lost his mind. Here was a man watching his forces being decimated, his carefully planned advance toward Germany halted, his reputation potentially destroyed, and he was smiling. But Eisenhower understood something his subordinates were only beginning to grasp. The Germans could be destroyed much more easily when they were out in the open and on the offensive than if they were on the defensive. Every mile the Germans advanced took them further from their supply bases, stretched their fuel lines thinner, and exposed them to counterattacks from multiple directions. Hitler had gambled everything on this offensive. If it failed, Germany would have no strategic reserves left. George Patton, whose Third Army was positioned to the south, immediately grasped the implications. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris," Patton responded. "Then we'll really cut 'em off and chew 'em up." This was the moment that defined Eisenhower's greatness as a commander. While others saw disaster, he saw opportunity. While others wanted to react defensively, he was already thinking offensively. His plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its audacity. Let the Germans advance until they were fully committed, then squeeze them from both sides like a vice. It would require perfect timing, flawless coordination, and the willingness to let American soldiers absorb enormous punishment while the trap was being set. Eisenhower's decision was not without its critics, both at the time and in historical analysis. Some argued that his initial dispositions in the Ardennes were too weak, that intelligence failures allowed the Germans to achieve complete surprise, that American casualties could have been reduced with more aggressive, immediate counterattacks. Military historians have debated whether Eisenhower's opportunity not disaster mindset was brilliant strategic thinking or post hoc rationalization of a near catastrophe. After all, the Battle of the Bulge would become the bloodiest single battle fought by American forces in World War II, with over 105,000 American casualties, roughly 1 in 10 of all American casualties for the entire war. The ethical dimension cannot be ignored either. Eisenhower's strategy essentially required American soldiers to absorb the initial German assault while he positioned forces for the counterattack. Young men from the 106th Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division, and other units bore the brunt of this strategic patience. They paid with their lives for time that allowed Eisenhower to execute his broader plan. Yet when compared to other military leaders of the era, Eisenhower's approach reveals its sophistication. Hitler's increasingly desperate offensives throughout 1944 and 1945 showed a leader who had lost the ability to think strategically. Stalin's human wave tactics on the Eastern Front achieved objectives but at horrific cost. Even brilliant tactical commanders like Rommel or Guderian often failed when elevated to strategic command because they couldn't make the transition from winning battles to winning wars. Eisenhower's genius lay in his ability to think at multiple levels simultaneously: tactical, operational, and strategic, while managing the complex coalition of American, British, French, and other Allied forces. His decision to frame the Bulge as opportunity rather than disaster was as much about coalition management as military strategy. By maintaining confidence and unity of command, he prevented the kind of paralysis that had doomed Allied efforts in earlier campaigns. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, with complete Allied victory. What began as Hitler's last great gamble to split the Western Alliance became instead the destruction of Germany's last strategic reserve. The Wehrmacht had thrown everything into this offensive: their best remaining panzer divisions, their most experienced troops, their dwindling fuel reserves. When it failed, Germany's ability to conduct major offensive operations died with it. But the true measure of Eisenhower's leadership wasn't just in the tactical victory, it was in how he transformed a moment of crisis into an opportunity for growth. As he would later write, "I believe we can always rely, even as I had to in the Battle of the Bulge and the concurrent winter fighting from the North Sea to the Italian Alps, on the willingness and readiness of Americans, including young ones, to endure greatly in their country's cause." The lessons of that cold December in 1944 extend far beyond military strategy. Eisenhower's response to being surrounded teaches us that true leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about maintaining clarity of purpose when everything seems to be falling apart. It's about seeing opportunity where others see only disaster. It's about making the hard choices that serve the greater good, even when those choices exact a terrible price. When the German panzers came roaring out of the Ardennes Forest on that snowy December morning, they thought they were striking a decisive blow against a complacent enemy. Instead, they were about to encounter something they hadn't bargained for: an American general who understood that sometimes the best way to win is to let your enemy think they're winning, right up until the moment you destroy them completely. That's the difference between a commander and a leader. A commander reacts to what's happening. A leader shapes what's going to happen. And on December 19, 1944, in that freezing barracks room in Verdun, Dwight Eisenhower didn't just shape the outcome of one battle, he shaped the future of the free world. The Germans thought they had them surrounded, but Eisenhower had something they never expected: the vision to see beyond the immediate crisis to ultimate victory. and that made all the difference in the world.